The morning sun cast long shadows across the concrete courtyard of the presidential palace in Ouagadougou as Captain Ibrahim Traoré reviewed the intelligence reports that had arrived during the night. At 25, he had become the world's youngest head of state through decisive action rather than electoral politics, and the weight of leadership showed in the methodical way he processed each document. The air conditioning hummed softly in his office, a luxury that contrasted sharply with the modest circumstances of his childhood in the village of Kera. His aide, Colonel Mamadou Sankara, entered without ceremony, carrying a tablet displaying satellite imagery. "Captain, we have confirmation of the strike," he said, his voice tight with controlled anger. The images showed the smoldering remains of what had been a convoy of trucks near the border with Niger, carrying medical supplies destined for Palestinian refugees who had been granted asylum in Burkina Faso as part of the country's humanitarian initiatives. Traoré studied the photographs with the trained eye of a military officer who had spent years combating insurgencies in the Sahel. The precision of the strike, the minimal collateral damage to surrounding infrastructure, and the targeting of specific vehicles all pointed to advanced military capabilities. "Israeli drones?" he asked, though the question was largely rhetorical. "The technical signature matches previous operations in Gaza and the West Bank," Sankara confirmed. "Our intelligence sources in Niamey report unusual aircraft activity in the hours preceding the attack. The convoy was clearly marked with red crescent symbols and had been coordinating with international humanitarian organizations." The captain set down the tablet and walked to the window overlooking the capital city, where nearly 3 million people went about their daily lives, unaware that their country had just been thrust into the center of an international crisis. Burkina Faso's decision to offer sanctuary to Palestinian refugees had been controversial within the African Union, but Traoré had viewed it as consistent with the Pan-Africanist principles that guided his government's foreign policy. "How many casualties?" he asked, his back still turned to his aide. 17 confirmed dead, including Dr. Fatima Al-Zahra, the Palestinian physician who was coordinating the refugee medical program. 23 wounded, some critically. The Israeli government has not acknowledged responsibility, but they haven't denied it either. Traoré closed his eyes briefly, thinking of the conversations he had had with Dr. Al-Zahra during her visits to the palace. She had spoken passionately about building bridges between African and Arab peoples, about creating models of solidarity that could inspire the global South. Her work with refugee children had been featured in international media as an example of Burkina Faso's commitment to humanitarian values, despite its limited resources. The secure phone on his desk buzzed with an encrypted call from President Bassirou Diomaye Faye of Senegal. Traoré answered on the second ring, switching to French. "Bassirou, I assume you've seen the reports. The entire ECOWAS leadership is in emergency session," Faye replied, his voice carrying the weight of diplomatic experience that Traoré sometimes envied. "The international community is watching how we respond. There are concerns that this could destabilize the entire Sahel region if it escalates." "The Israelis attacked a clearly marked humanitarian convoy on African soil," Traoré said, his voice steady, but carrying an edge that those who knew him recognized as dangerous. "This isn't about destabilization. This is about sovereignty and the principle that African lives matter as much as any others." There was a pause on the line before Faye continued. "Ibrahim, I understand your anger, and frankly, many of us share it. But Netanyahu's government is under pressure from multiple fronts. They may have seen the refugee program as a security threat, however misguided that assessment might be." Traoré turned back to face Sankara, who was monitoring multiple communication channels on his laptop. The colonel's expression indicated that international reaction was already beginning to pour in through diplomatic channels. "Bassirou, with respect, I didn't seize power in this country to manage other people's fears about how we might respond to aggression. Dr. Al-Zahra and her team were providing medical care to children. If that constitutes a security threat in Tel Aviv's assessment, then perhaps it's time for a more direct conversation." After ending the call, Traoré spent several minutes in silence, processing the implications of what had occurred. His rise to power had been predicated on breaking Burkina Faso's dependent relationships with former colonial powers and building new partnerships based on mutual respect. The Palestinian refugee program had been part of that broader vision, demonstrating that African nations could provide humanitarian leadership on global issues. The intercom crackled to life with his secretary's voice. "Captain, the Israeli ambassador is requesting an urgent meeting. Tell Ambassador Cohen that if he wants to discuss what happened to our humanitarian convoy, he can submit his explanations in writing through proper diplomatic channels," Traoré replied. "And contact our foreign ministry. I want a full assessment of our diplomatic options within 6 hours." Sankara looked up from his laptop. "Sir, there's something else. Our contacts in the intelligence community are reporting unusual movement of Israeli assets in the region. It appears this may not have been an isolated incident." The implication hung in the air between them. Traoré had built his political career on decisive action, but the stakes of this particular crisis extended far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. The next few hours would determine whether this remained a diplomatic incident or escalated into something that could reshape relationships across the African continent and the Middle East. The African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa buzzed with unusual activity as news of the convoy attack spread through diplomatic circles. In a secure conference room, representatives from across the continent gathered for an emergency virtual session that would determine the organization's response to what many were calling an unprecedented violation of African sovereignty. Traoré's image appeared on the main screen, transmitted from his command center in Ouagadougou, where he had been working through the night with his senior advisors. The traditional keffiyeh draped over his military uniform served as a deliberate symbol of solidarity with the Palestinian refugees his country had welcomed, a gesture that had not gone unnoticed by international observers. "Fellow African leaders," he began, his voice carrying the authority that had enabled him to unite a fractured nation, "we face a moment that will define how the international community views African sovereignty. Yesterday's attack was not merely against Burkina Faso, but against our collective commitment to humanitarian principles and our right to conduct foreign policy free from external intimidation." President Cyril Ramaphosa of South Africa, participating from Cape Town, leaned forward in his chair. His own country's complex relationship with Israel, shaped by decades of anti-apartheid solidarity with Palestine, gave weight to his words. "Captain Traoré, South Africa stands with Burkina Faso in condemning this attack. However, we must also consider the broader implications of any response. The regional security situation in the Sahel is already fragile." From Lagos, President Bola Tinubu's presence on the call represented Nigeria's significant influence within African diplomatic circles. "The question before us," he said, "is whether we allow external powers to dictate the terms of African humanitarian policy through military action. If we fail to respond decisively, what message does that send about African unity and sovereignty?" The conversation was interrupted by an aide handing Traoré an urgent message. His expression darkened as he read the brief report. "I've just received confirmation that a second convoy, this one carrying educational supplies to refugee camps, has been forced to turn back after being threatened by Israeli aircraft. It appears yesterday's attack was not an isolated incident, but part of a systematic campaign to halt our humanitarian program." President William Ruto of Kenya, joining from Nairobi, spoke with the measured tone of someone who had navigated complex regional conflicts throughout his career. "This escalation concerns us greatly. Kenya has maintained constructive relationships with both Israel and Palestine, but we cannot accept the precedent that humanitarian operations in Africa can be subject to military intervention based on the political preferences of external powers." The discussion continued for over 2 hours, with each leader weighing the implications of various response options. Some advocated for immediate referral to the United Nations Security Council, while others pushed for coordinated economic measures. Traoré listened carefully to each perspective, but his mind was already focused on a more direct approach. Following the AU session, Traoré convened a meeting with his military advisors in the palace's secure briefing room. The walls displayed maps of the Sahel region, marked with the locations of various military installations and known insurgent activities that had shaped Burkina Faso's security priorities since independence. General Célestin Simporé, the country's defense minister, spread out intelligence reports on the conference table. "Captain, Our analysis indicates that Israeli intelligence has been monitoring the refugee program since its inception. The precision of yesterday's strike suggests detailed advance planning, not a spontaneous response to perceived threats. What are our defensive capabilities if this escalates? Traoré asked, studying the deployment maps that showed the positioning of Burkina Faso's limited but well-trained military forces. Our air defense systems are modest but functional, the general replied honestly. However, our real strength lies in asymmetric capabilities and the support we've built with other Sahel nations through the alliance of Sahel states. Mali and Niger have both indicated they would view further attacks on Burkina Faso as threats to regional stability. The meeting was interrupted by the arrival of Foreign Minister Olivia Ruamba, who had been coordinating with international partners since the previous day's events. Her expression indicated significant developments in the diplomatic arena. "Captain, I've just concluded conversations with officials in Cairo, Damascus, and Ramallah," she reported. "The Arab League is preparing a formal statement of support, and several Middle Eastern countries are offering military cooperation if the situation escalates. More significantly, we've received indirect communications from Tehran indicating Iran's interest in supporting our position." Traoré absorbed this information while considering its implications for Burkina Faso's traditionally non-aligned foreign policy. His government had sought to build relationships across ideological divides, but the current crisis was forcing difficult choices about international partnerships. What about the Israelis? Any communication from Tel Aviv? Ambassador Cohen has requested a private meeting, claiming he has a personal message from Prime Minister Netanyahu. The message apparently emphasizes Israel's commitment to regional stability and suggests the possibility of compensation for yesterday's incident, provided we discontinue the refugee program. The room fell silent as the implications of this offer became clear. Traoré stood and walked to the window, looking out at the bustling streets of Ouagadougou, where normal life continued, despite the international crisis developing around them. "Schedule the meeting with Ambassador Cohen for tomorrow morning," he said finally, "but make it clear that any discussion of ending our humanitarian commitments is off the table." If Prime Minister Netanyahu wants to discuss compensation, he can start by explaining why he believes African children seeking medical care constitute a threat to Israeli security. As his advisors filed out of the room, Traoré remained by the window, contemplating the path that had led from a military coup aimed at combating corruption and foreign interference to a potential confrontation with one of the world's most powerful military forces. The decisions he made in the coming days would determine not only his country's future, but potentially reshape the balance of power across the African continent. Ambassador David Cohen arrived at the presidential palace precisely at 9 in the morning, his diplomatic convoy navigating through streets where increased security was visible, but not oppressive. The Israeli embassy had been in Ouagadougou for less than 2 years, part of a broader Israeli diplomatic initiative across West Africa, but the current crisis had thrust the small mission into the center of an international incident with far-reaching implications. Traoré received the ambassador in his formal office, a room that blended traditional Burkinabe artwork with the practical necessities of modern governance. The captain wore his standard military uniform without decorations, a deliberate choice that emphasized his role as a soldier, rather than a conventional politician. 2 chairs faced each other across a coffee table, with Colonel Sankara positioned discreetly to one side to take notes. "Mr. Ambassador," Traoré began without preamble, "I trust you understand the gravity of why we're meeting." Cohen, a career diplomat with extensive experience in African postings, placed a sealed envelope on the table between them. "Captain Traoré, I carry a personal message from Prime Minister Netanyahu. Before I deliver it, I want to express Israel's regret for the loss of life in yesterday's incident. That was never our intention." "Your intention," Traoré replied evenly, "was to attack a clearly marked humanitarian convoy carrying medical supplies to refugee children. Whether those 17 people were intended to die is less relevant than the fact that your government chose to use military force against a humanitarian operation in a sovereign African nation." The ambassador opened the envelope and withdrew a single sheet of official letterhead. The Prime Minister's message is brief but direct. He acknowledges that the operational decision may have been based on incomplete intelligence. Israel is prepared to provide substantial compensation to the families of those killed and to support expanded humanitarian programs in Burkina Faso, provided they focus on local populations rather than Palestinian refugees. Traoré studied the letter for several minutes, his expression giving nothing away to the diplomat sitting across from him. The text was carefully crafted, offering financial compensation while avoiding any admission of wrongdoing and including implicit conditions that would effectively end Burkina Faso's Palestinian refugee program. "Tell me, Ambassador Cohen," Traoré said, setting the letter aside, "does Prime Minister Netanyahu believe that African sovereignty is negotiable? That our decisions about humanitarian policy can be modified through military pressure?" Cohen shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Captain, I think there may be misunderstandings on both sides. Israel faces existential security threats and sometimes must act on intelligence that later proves incomplete. The refugee program, however well-intentioned, creates operational challenges that... Dr. Fatima Al-Zahra was treating children with malnutrition and preventable diseases," Traoré interrupted, his voice remaining calm but carrying an edge of steel. "Please explain to me how a pediatrician providing medical care to refugees constitutes an operational challenge requiring military response." The room fell silent, except for the distant sounds of traffic in the capital city. Cohen appeared to be considering his response carefully, aware that his words would likely be transmitted directly to Tel Aviv and could influence the trajectory of an already volatile situation. "Captain Traoré, I've served in 7 African countries during my diplomatic career. I have great respect for African leadership and sovereignty. Sometimes, however, external security concerns require difficult decisions. Prime Minister Netanyahu believes this situation can be resolved through dialogue and mutual cooperation." Traoré stood and walked to his desk, where he picked up a folder containing photographs from the attack site. He returned to the ambassador and spread the images on the coffee table. Burned vehicles, destroyed medical equipment, and the personal effects of humanitarian workers scattered across the desert. "This is your government's idea of dialogue, Ambassador. 17 people died because Prime Minister Netanyahu apparently believes he has the right to dictate African humanitarian policy through drone strikes. I want you to return to Tel Aviv and deliver a message from me personally." Cohen reached for his notepad, preparing to transcribe the response that would undoubtedly escalate the diplomatic crisis. "Tell Prime Minister Netanyahu that Burkina Faso's Palestinian refugee program will continue exactly as planned. We will expand it if necessary. Dr. Al-Zahra's medical clinic will be rebuilt and renamed in her honor. And if Israeli forces launch any further attacks on humanitarian operations in Burkina Faso, whether against Palestinian refugees or anyone else, my government will consider it an act of war and respond accordingly." The ambassador's pen stopped moving. "Captain, I must urge you to consider the implications of such a statement. Israel has significant military capabilities and important relationships throughout the international community. I'm sure Prime Minister Netanyahu is aware of Israel's military capabilities," Traoré replied, his tone unchanged. "I want him to be equally aware of mine. We have defeated insurgencies across the Sahel, overthrown corrupt governments, and built new partnerships across Africa and beyond. If he believes African lives are expendable in service of his security concerns, he will discover otherwise." Traoré walked to a wall map, showing the locations of Alliance of Sahel states' military installations across the region. "You might also inform the Prime Minister that Mali and Niger have both indicated they view any further attacks on Burkina Faso as threats to regional stability. We are not isolated, and we are not defenseless." As the meeting concluded, Cohen gathered his materials with the demeanor of someone who recognized that diplomacy had reached its limits. "Captain Traoré, I will deliver your message exactly as stated. I hope cooler heads will prevail before this situation spirals beyond diplomatic control." "Ambassador," Traoré said as he escorted the diplomat to the door, "cooler heads would have prevented your government from attacking a medical convoy in the first place. The next move is Prime Minister Netanyahu's, but he should understand that Burkina Faso will not be intimidated into abandoning our principles or our humanitarian commitments." After Cohen's departure, Traoré remained in his office reviewing intelligence reports that indicated unusual Israeli military activity across the region. The confrontation he had just initiated would likely have consequences extending far beyond the borders of his own country. But the alternative, accepting external dictation of African policy, was unacceptable to someone who had devoted his career to continental sovereignty and dignity. The secure communications center beneath the presidential palace operated around the clock, but the intensity of activity following Traoré's meeting with Ambassador Cohen exceeded anything the facility had experienced since the captain's rise to power. Diplomatic messages flooded in from capitals across Africa, the Middle East and beyond, as news of the confrontation spread through international networks. In Cairo, President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi convened an emergency meeting of his National Security Council, recognizing that the escalating crisis could reshape regional alliances in ways that affected Egyptian interests across the Horn of Africa and the Sahel. His foreign minister reported growing pressure from Arab League members to support Burkina Faso's position, particularly as images of the destroyed medical convoy circulated across Arabic-language media. "The young captain has put us in a difficult position," el-Sisi observed to his advisors. "Egypt maintains important relationships with both Israel and our African partners. However, the principle of African sovereignty cannot be ignored, particularly when humanitarian operations are targeted." Similar calculations were taking place in Riyadh, where Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman faced pressure from those within the Saudi leadership who viewed Traoré's defiance as an opportunity to demonstrate Arab solidarity with Africa, potentially advancing the kingdom's own expanding influence across the continent. In Tehran, the situation presented different opportunities. Iran's regional strategy had long sought to build partnerships that could challenge Israeli influence, and Burkina Faso's confrontational stance offered possibilities for expanding Iranian presence in West Africa. Intelligence officials prepared assessments of potential military cooperation that could significantly complicate Israel's security calculations. The most significant international reaction, however, came from an unexpected source. In Beijing, President Xi Jinping's foreign policy team recognized the crisis as potentially decisive for China's broader African strategy. A private message arrived at the presidential palace in Ouagadougou within hours of Cohen's departure, requesting urgent consultations about Chinese support for Burkina Faso's position. Traoré received the Chinese ambassador, Chen Wei, in the same office where he had confronted the Israeli diplomat hours earlier, but the atmosphere was markedly different. Chen came bearing offers of substantial technical assistance and economic support, rather than demands for policy changes. "Captain Traoré," Chen began, "President Xi has instructed me to convey China's strong support for Burkina Faso's sovereign right to conduct humanitarian policy without external interference. We view yesterday's attack as completely unacceptable under international law. The Chinese offer included advanced air defense systems, intelligence sharing capabilities, and economic assistance that could transform Burkina Faso's ability to project power across the Sahel region. More significantly, it represented potential Chinese military involvement in West Africa that could fundamentally alter regional security dynamics. We appreciate China's support," Traoré replied carefully, "but we want our partners to understand that Burkina Faso's response to this crisis will be determined by our own assessment of our interests and principles, not by external pressure from any source." Meanwhile, in Washington, the Biden administration faced its own complicated calculations. Secretary of State Antony Blinken convened urgent meetings to assess American interests in what was rapidly becoming a multi-dimensional crisis involving Israeli security concerns, African sovereignty, and potential Chinese and Iranian involvement in a strategically important region. The State Department's Africa desk recommended immediate diplomatic intervention to prevent escalation, recognizing that continued crisis could destabilize American counterterrorism operations across the Sahel and potentially strengthen Chinese influence in a region where the United States had invested heavily in security partnerships. European reactions proved equally complex. In Paris, President Macron's government struggled with the implications of supporting either side in a confrontation that involved France's former colony challenging a key Middle Eastern ally. The Élysée Palace issued a carefully worded statement calling for de-escalation while emphasizing respect for African sovereignty. The most vocal European support for Traoré's position came from unexpected quarters. In Dublin, Irish Prime Minister Leo Varadkar, drawing on Ireland's own historical experience with asymmetric resistance against a more powerful neighbour, issued a strong statement supporting Burkina Faso's right to provide humanitarian assistance without external military interference. The targeting of clearly marked medical convoys, Varadkar declared in a televised statement, represents a violation of international humanitarian law regardless of the political circumstances. Ireland stands with all nations defending their sovereign right to provide humanitarian assistance. As international positions crystallized, Traoré convened another meeting with his senior advisors to assess the rapidly evolving situation. Intelligence reports indicated that Israeli forces had been placed on higher alert status, while Iranian naval vessels had altered course toward West African ports, and Chinese military advisors were reportedly preparing to deploy to Burkina Faso. Captain, Foreign Minister Rwanda reported, "We're receiving offers of support from every corner of the international community, but many come with implicit expectations about our future policies. The Chinese want military base rights, the Iranians are proposing weapons transfers, and even the Americans are suggesting security partnerships if we moderate our rhetoric." Traoré studied a world map on his office wall, where colored pins marked the locations of countries offering various forms of support. The crisis he had initiated by refusing to accept external dictation of his country's humanitarian policies was reshaping international alignments in ways that extended far beyond the original dispute. "Our position remains unchanged," he said finally. "Burkina Faso will accept support that strengthens our sovereignty without compromising our independence. We will not become anyone's proxy in exchange for protection from Israeli aggression." The captain's determination to maintain independence while building sufficient defensive capabilities would prove crucial, as intelligence reports suggested that Tel Aviv was considering more dramatic military action to force Burkina Faso's compliance with Israeli security demands. 3 days after Ambassador Cohen's departure from Ouagadougou, a new diplomatic communication arrived at the presidential palace through encrypted channels that bypassed normal embassy procedures. The message, transmitted directly from Prime Minister Netanyahu's office, carried the formal weight of an ultimatum and marked a decisive escalation in the confrontation between Israel and Burkina Faso. Traoré read Netanyahu's response in the presence of his senior advisors, the weight of international crisis evident in the careful silence that filled the secure briefing room. The Israeli Prime Minister's message was characteristically direct. Burkina Faso had 48 hours to announce the termination of its Palestinian refugee program and expel all Palestinian nationals from its territory, or Israel would take necessary defensive action to protect its security interests. He's essentially demanding we choose between our humanitarian principles and avoiding military confrontation, Colonel Sankara observed, reviewing the message's precise language. The timing suggests coordination with other pressures we're facing. Intelligence reports confirmed Sankara's assessment. Israeli naval vessels had moved into positions off the West African coast, supposedly for routine exercises, while diplomatic pressure intensified through channels including the United States and several European allies who were urging Burkina Faso to accept a face-saving compromise. Foreign Minister Rwanda entered the briefing room, carrying updates from her contacts across the African diplomatic community. The African Union is preparing an emergency session, but there are deep divisions about how to respond. Nigeria and South Africa are pushing for strong collective action, while others worry about the precedent of confronting a major military power over what they see as a peripheral issue. Traoré walked to the window overlooking the capital city, where life continued with the normal rhythms of a developing nation, focused on daily survival rather than international crises. Street vendors sold food to workers hurrying between offices, children walked to school in uniforms their families had struggled to afford, and the sounds of construction echoed from development projects funded through partnerships with China, Turkey, and other emerging powers. "Schedule a national address for this evening," he instructed his communications director. "The people of Burkina Faso deserve to understand what's at stake and why their government has chosen this path." The afternoon was spent preparing for what everyone recognized could be the last diplomatic opportunity before military action became inevitable. Traoré's speech would be broadcast across Africa through satellite networks, with simultaneous translation into Arabic, French, and English to reach the widest possible international audience. As evening approached, television crews from international networks set up equipment in the palace's main reception hall, where a simple podium had been positioned against a backdrop displaying the national flag alongside the flag of the African Union. Traoré wore his military uniform with the addition of a kente cloth sash that symbolized Pan-African unity, a deliberate visual reminder that the crisis extended beyond bilateral relations between Burkina Faso and Israel. Citizens of Burkina Faso, brothers and sisters across Africa, friends of justice around the world, he began, his voice carrying the authority that had enabled him to navigate the complex challenges of governing a country that many had written off as ungovernable. 3 days ago, Israeli forces attacked a clearly marked medical convoy carrying supplies to Palestinian refugee children who had found safety in our country. 17 humanitarian workers died in that attack, including Dr. Fatima Al-Zahra, whose only crime was providing medical care to vulnerable children. The camera captured the controlled intensity in Traoré's expression as he continued, "Today, the Israeli government has delivered an ultimatum demanding that we abandon our humanitarian commitments and expel the refugees we have welcomed. They have given us 48 hours to comply or face what they call defensive action against our sovereign territory." Across the continent, leaders gathered around television screens to hear how the world's youngest head of state would respond to pressure from one of the world's most powerful military forces. In Addis Ababa, African Union officials prepared emergency protocols for collective response to what could become the first direct military confrontation between an African nation and a major external power in decades. "Let me be absolutely clear about Burkina Faso's position," Traoré continued, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. "We will not abandon the refugees who have sought our protection. We will not allow external powers to dictate our humanitarian policies through military threats. And we will not accept that African sovereignty can be violated whenever other nations claim security concerns." The speech continued for 15 minutes, outlining Burkina Faso's legal and moral position while acknowledging the risks involved in confronting a vastly superior military force. Traoré emphasized the support his government had received from across Africa and beyond, but made clear that the decision to resist Israeli pressure was based on principle rather than confidence in military victory. If Prime Minister Netanyahu chooses military action against humanitarian operations in Burkina Faso, he concluded, he will discover that African dignity cannot be destroyed by drone strikes or intimidated by ultimatums. We have faced insurgencies, corruption, and poverty with determination and unity. We will face this challenge the same way. Within hours of the broadcast, responses flooded in from across the international community. The Organization of Islamic Cooperation announced emergency measures supporting Burkina Faso's position, while several African nations indicated they would view Israeli military action as an attack on continental sovereignty, requiring collective response. More ominously, intelligence reports confirmed that Israeli military assets were moving into position for what appeared to be preparation for significant military action. The 48-hour deadline was not merely diplomatic pressure, but apparently genuine preparation for escalation if Traoré maintained his defiant position. As midnight approached, marking the beginning of what could be the final day before military confrontation, Traoré remained in his office reviewing defensive preparations and diplomatic alternatives. The decisions made in the next 24 hours would determine whether his principled stand against external pressure would inspire a new era of African sovereignty or result in devastating consequences for his country and people. The weight of leadership had never felt heavier, but the captain who had risen to power through decisive action under pressure showed no signs of wavering in his commitment to the humanitarian principles that had defined his government's approach to the Palestinian refugee crisis. Outside the palace windows, Ouagadougou slept uneasily, aware that their young leader had chosen a path that could reshape not only their nation's future, but the broader relationship between Africa and the world powers that had long treated the continent as a subordinate player in global affairs. The next day would test whether courage and principle could prevail against overwhelming military superiority, or whether the realities of power would force even the most determined African leader to compromise his convictions when faced with existential threats.